Koutou katoa. Greetings everybody. It is my great pleasure to be with you today in the coveted morning after the party slot that you've given me today. So thank you to Infrastructure New Zealand for this rare honour. I believe the product's called Revival. I think it's always important to name the product as it is, and so I'm no doubt there'll be some kind of trading market breaking out on the floor as people try and get their Revival tablets to get themselves going this morning. Can I just acknowledge Stephen Selwood one more time? I know I came to you in virtual form last night to acknowledge Stephen in the work that he's done. He really has been an advocate like no other in terms of sectors that we work with and face up to from time to time. And I think I might have said it in the video, Stephen, last night, but one of the things I genuinely remember is the fact that you were prepared to give the time of day to the opposition. You were actually prepared to give the time of day to the opposition when pretty much the public weren't giving us the time of day, and that meant a lot to us because I think if you are going to build long-term vision and plans for the infrastructure industry, you need to work across the political spectrum, and your willingness to do that when we're in opposition is something that I will always remember. So Stephen, again, on behalf of the government, I want to thank you for everything you've done. I know you're not really retiring at all, and you'll still be around to annoy us. No, you'll still be around to advocate strongly for your sector. So thank you once again, Stephen, for everything that you've done. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to, now that the dry ice has moved and I can actually see you, I'm going to move on to 2 or 3 topics today which are focused around your main theme about how we support the regions and how we make sure infrastructure works right across New Zealand. I want to do that in the context of the fact that you've already heard from my colleague, the Honourable Shane Jones, and learned a bit more about where the Infrastructure Commission is going. And shortly, later on this morning, you'll hear from Phil Twyford, who I know is going to talk to you in some detail about how we are advancing the new way of undertaking infrastructure work that we have, in particular around the spatial planning work, which Hamish has already alluded to, but some specific projects, very large ones, that we think the industry will get on board with, that do pick up the main theme of what I believe is how the government is trying to do things differently, and that is to look at our infrastructure development in a wider context and integrate it into the kind of society that we're trying to build. So be it making sure that transport projects are linked to urban development, or be it that we try and link the development of our schools and our education system to where we're going in terms of our process. So we are genuinely excited by the opportunities that come from taking that kind of more integrated vision into the way we fund and support infrastructure. Obviously, it's my job to look at these things through a financial lens. As Shane often likes to say to me, you're the man with the big checkbook. I say to him, Shane, you've got the really big checkbook at the moment, but between the two of us, we do. But before I start talking about the dollars and cents, I think most of you will know that my focus as a Minister of Finance has been to broaden the way in which we think about what success is as a country through the wellbeing framework, but also to use that framework to decide what we invest in. Because my belief is that just having a balanced scorecard or just having measures that you look at that aren't just fiscal ones but are also environmental or social isn't actually enough. What's needed is using that framework to drive decisions, using the evidence that we have about what makes a difference to our overall well-being in the decisions we make about where investments go. And I want to reassure those in the room and those in the infrastructure industry that infrastructure is core to our well-being. Now, I'm probably preaching to the choir in that regard, but I think it's worth saying at the outset that by taking a well-being approach, at the core of that is good quality infrastructure. And if you just look at the 4 capitals that underlie the Treasury's Living Standards framework that we've used at the core of our wellbeing approach, you see infrastructure's role. So in terms of physical or financial capital, clearly it's core. It is, in fact, our physical capital, our infrastructure. It's what underpins our ability to deliver within those other areas that are important to us. But if we look at the other areas where perhaps you mightn't see infrastructure's role so clearly, in terms of human capital, in terms of our ability as people to fulfill our potential, it is critical. It underpins our education system, it underpins our health system, it underpins the way in which we interact with one another as people. So when we're talking about infrastructure, it is a massive enabler to the development of human capital. If we talk about natural capital, which is perhaps where sometimes the challenge arises a little bit for infrastructure, so natural capital being the environment and the way in which we protect and support it, actually the best possible decisions we can make are to see that as a partnership, to see the fact that actually infrastructure is a partner in developing and enhancing natural capital and making sure that we protect what is the best of our country and use the resources that we have well and sensibly and sustainably. And then in terms of social capital, the fourth of the legs of our well-being framework, I see infrastructure as the glue in social capital. Social capital is the idea that it is about our interactions, it is about the communities that we build that strengthen our society. And again, the quality of the infrastructure that we have, the ability for it to be available for all, makes it work. So as I say, I'm possibly preaching to the choir, but I want to make the point that a well-being approach isn't some soft approach that leaves infrastructure on the side. It actually is core to all the elements of what we're trying to do as a government, and I hope that as you are developing ideas and proposals, you can see that and use that as a way of advancing the kind of quality integrated infrastructure that we're all looking for. In terms of the core of what I've been asked to talk about today, the basic premise I'm going to advance to you this morning is that actually the development of our regions and the development of our cities and the development of our country do go together. And the things that are good for our country as a whole will be good for regions, and the things that are good for regions will be good for the country as a whole. And at the start of that process from a government point of view has been the way that we're thinking about the institutions and frameworks that lie underneath how our infrastructure works. As I've said, I'm not going to go into a long speech about the Infrastructure Commission because you heard about that yesterday, but to me that stands as a shining light of exactly the challenge that Hamish laid down to me. How do we get better coherence and better coordination in what we do? This is, the creation of this Infrastructure Commission is a direct response to this industry's call. And so if you are looking for the fruits of Stephen Selwood's labour, that's where you'll find it, because that commission has been consistently called for and we are really pleased to get it going. Absolutely no pressure on Alan Bollard and his team to get that working as quickly as possible. But we do believe having that framework and that institution at the core of our future planning will pay dividends. But just as with a number of things that we're doing in this area, the immediate bang for buck might be hard to see. And I'm going to front that issue today because I know that there is frustration in this room about the pace of change and the pace of our ability to deliver. I share and feel that frustration. I can tell you as someone coming into government, we have, as you know, and as has been said, ambitious plans. And sometimes when you are changing the direction of the ship of state, when you do have to sort out a few messes along the way, things take longer. And some of what we inherited has made that difficult. Some of it's around the implementation of the programs that we've got. But our level of ambition is not diminished, and neither should it be, because that is what will drive New Zealand to lift our living standards. So the Infrastructure Commission is a good example of something that we have got going and is well underway. Within the broader urban growth agenda framework that Phil Twyford has been driving, I think it's fair to say there has been some significant advances there as well. And I want to give a special shout out today to the spatial planning partnerships that Phil has been developing, and I know he'll talk about later. Looking at places like Auckland, Hamilton, Queenstown, and I know Jim Bolt's here today. We're forming that relationship as a partnership. And I know you've been talking about the City Deals idea. From our perspective, actually what lies and underpins those spatial planning partnerships is exactly that approach. that we do need to be led by the local knowledge. We do need to be led by what is going to work in a particular region and be flexible and pragmatic in delivering that. And that's what we're trying to do through those partnerships. It's also what we're trying to do with some of the infrastructure financing and funding elements of the urban growth agenda as well. So be it special purpose vehicles that'll help get the Auckland to Hamilton corridor going, or be it a regional fuel tax in Auckland, or be it the Let's Get Wellington Moving approach in Wellington, which actually harnesses a longer term pipeline of government funding alongside two regional council and a city council funding, or be it the bed tax in Queenstown, where we put that back to Jim and said, well, if this is what your region really wants, prove that to us. And they did, and now we're working with them around that. So we have to be flexible about that. We have to develop those innovative funding and financing mechanisms, and as I say, SPVs are there. We're very conscious of the report of the Productivity Commission on local government funding and financing. We've had a look obviously at the draft. We now await the final report, but we have to be able to harness the partnership that exists between central and local government. All of that can only happen if we've actually got the funding to support it. Hoping this will work. There we go. It only works if we've actually got the funding to support it. And one of the legacies that unfortunately we have inherited is a limited investment in capital spending. It was mentioned before by Hamish, in the wellbeing budget we've got around $41 billion worth of capital spending rolling out over the next 5 years. That compares to the plan that we inherited, which was for around $30 billion over the 5-year period. We've upped that. That is as a result of the fact that we've been prepared to borrow more or pay debt back a little more slowly than the previous government had. But we know that that only works in partnership. It only works with us investing in partnership with local government and in partnership with the private sector, and we are in the process of enabling that in a number of projects around New Zealand. The point of the graph isn't really to make a major political point other than to say we need long-term consistent investment in capital spending. We can't afford the troughs that have occurred from time to time because we lose momentum and we lose capacity. When a government changes, we do change direction from time to time. That's what democracy is actually about. But what it means is that as we do ramp our spending up, we have to be consistent in that, and you'll see from that that we are. The other change in frameworks or institutions that I want to mention is around the way that we have been developing our capital allowances in government. So this is a slide from Budget 2019, and there's a couple of things I want to use it to demonstrate. The first of those is that we have tried to get ahead of the curve in terms of what's happening in the global economy. We were set to spend, in terms of new spending, $2.4 billion per annum for operating spending. We lifted that in the budget to $3.8 billion per annum, in part because the need that was in front of us, but also because we wanted to make sure that we were playing our role in stimulating the economy. I believe it's a similar approach to the one that the Reserve Bank Governor has taken by applying the monetary policy defibrillator and saying we actually need to get ahead of a curve. There's every reason to be confident about the New Zealand economy. We continue to grow faster than most of the countries we compare ourselves to: Australia, Canada, Japan, the UK, the Eurozone. It's just that that growth's slower than it's been. But relatively speaking, it is still faster. So New Zealand is in a strong position, but it does require investment both from ourselves and the monetary policy tools being used. But the bit that I want to talk about a bit more is the capital allowance. We made a decision in this year's budget to have a 4-year rolling capital allowance. Up until now, governments have had 1-year capital allowances. Now that has made for some distortionary decision making. For example, in a year in which the Minister of Defence comes to me and says we really need to upgrade the Air Force's capability, we agree that we've got to do that, we agree to buy 4 P8s, that's $2 billion, and if you're operating on an annual capital allowance, that wipes out most of it, because generally accepted accounting practice tells me that I have to account for that money the moment I decide to spend it, rather than when I actually spend it. So as a result, what we were getting was a bit of a first in, first served approach for capital spending. We've turned that around. We now have a 4-year rolling allowance. We increased that allowance, as you'll see on the slide there, to $14.8 billion, and we've allocated $10 billion of that in the first round of that, and then it gets replenished as we go. That kind of pipeline of decision making mirrors what we're trying to do with the Infrastructure Commission. It's 4 years because that's our operational budget cycle as well. And so putting through that multi-year allowance has allowed us to give some certainty in particular sectors. The example I want to give you, and it's on the slide there, is in our schools. It doesn't matter what government is in place, we will always continue to build schools and build hospitals. But at the moment, we've been going on annual allocations. What we've now done is we have a 10-year investment program. We've got a first wave of it coming through and 4 waves after that. So effectively 5 years of funding, over $1 billion guaranteed. That then gives certainty to the construction industry, to schools, to parents, that that work is being done. I know this is exactly the kind of certainty that you're looking for in horizontal infrastructure as well. That is the aim of going to a 4-year rolling allowance here, and the aim of the Infrastructure Commission, and indeed what is always laying behind the transport strategy and the National Land Transport Fund. Now we're trying to bring all of that together into a cohesive piece of work that gives a line of sight to the kind of infrastructure spending that's important to us. I just want to use the remaining time I've got to speak specifically about the regions in New Zealand. Firstly, to indicate that I believe that having undertaken the Provincial Growth Fund work, it is now beginning to bear fruit. And even just out in the foyer now, I've had 2 or 3 conversations with regional government and with those who work in the regions who are acknowledging that, yeah, it took a little while to get going because it was a new fund, but it is now starting to bear fruit in our regions. It is not just an infrastructure fund, and I'm sure Shane will have said this yesterday. It is designed to develop jobs across the region, but it can play a part in that. So we're pleased about that. But we also have to look to the future and think about, touch wood, if I get the honour of being the Finance Minister in the next government, what does that regional development look like? How can we learn the lessons of what we have seen in the Provincial Growth Fund and take that forward? And I'll draw a couple of those lessons today without jumping ahead of ourselves as to what might happen. The first of those is that things have worked best when a region has come together and identified their own priorities. Where we've seen that in the far north, where we've seen that down on the west coast of the South Island, we've been able to pull on the resources and the knowledge and the awareness of regional government. That is the best kind of partnership. If those regional councils, local government, business, iwi and community groups in those areas can come up with a plan that will be attractive to us, that will develop the kind of partnership that we are after. So I believe where things have worked best in the PGF, that is actually where that has occurred. Doesn't mean we agree every single time, but it does mean we've got a basis for our discussion that actually is a regional need. And so I think as we move forward and evolve our approach to regional development, that's very much the way that I see it. The second thing I want to mention is around the question of how flexible and pragmatic we can be around financing and funding. It is absolutely essential that we listen to regions in this regard. I am not going to stand on the stage and say that regions will get their GST back. No Minister of Finance, I venture to suggest, will ever say that. And the reason for that is not just around wanting to be the person who hoards revenue. It is actually that we need, in a country the size of New Zealand, a form of integrated development, and our tax system works well because it is simple and clear. But what we can do is ensure that we are working with regions and being practical and pragmatic, and the example in Queenstown is the one that I would give you there. And then the third point is actually to make use of the institutions that we have now created, to ensure within the Infrastructure Commission approach we think regionally, to make sure as we develop these spatial planning partnerships that they take in a regional view, not just the immediate city that is around it. It is a really important issue in Auckland, and you would have seen the release of the National Policy Statement on Elite Soils and the release of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development in quick succession. That gives you an idea of some of the issues that we've got to manage around how development works as our cities and urban centres grow towards our more rural centres. That is absolutely doable as long as we get clarity. And I think the work that David Parker is leading in the reform of the Resource Management Act is absolutely critical in this, and I urge you all to engage in that. We have the opportunity to continue to take the best bits of the RMA, but actually make sure that we get the bit that's been missing from the beginning, which is adequate national level policy guidance and standards. That's what we're trying to do with those, the urban development and elite soils NPSs that are now out there. So I believe the framework is now in place for our development as a country to be coordinated and cohesive. You do have to sometimes go back and reset the framework in order to take the long-term view that our government has. We've done that. We're now in the implementation phase, and I believe if we do this together, thinking not just as regions, but thinking as a country about how the growth of our regions sustainably will improve our whole country's prospects, then we're well on the path to success. Thank you for listening to me today, and ask Phil all of the difficult questions later this morning. Kia ora tātou.